2.5, developments in Africa in the post-classical era from 1200 to 1450 CE. So we've talked a little bit about Africa beforehand, right? And our kind of post-classical, like post-classical part one, right? 600 to 1200, right? So we're going to kind of pick up a lot of that same conversation, right? The Bantu migrations are a very big deal in African culture and African society, right? So they had spread out for about 1,500 years, and one of the key things they brought with them is agriculture, right? The other two being ironworking, and then the Bantu language, right? I'll kind of put those over here because they don't talk about that here in this particular section. And the reason they're talking about agriculture is that since agriculture is sedentary, right, needed more, there's a lot more people living in the same place. And so because of that, they needed more complex institutions to deal with it. And what we mean by institutions is things like a government, right? And governments and religion probably being two of the bigger institutions people kind of know about, right? So we've seen that, though. We've seen that in a lot of places already. However, what happens in Africa, instead of creating the kind of empires we know, even the Republic of Rome and stuff like that, or the kingdoms we know, they create kin-based societies, kin-based networks of societies, right? Where you have families kind of govern families, right? Families govern themselves. Very extended families, to be sure, but families are definitely governing themselves. Led by a chief, right, who's kind of in charge, kind of like the eldest male usually. And the chief of each kin-based group tends to mediate with other kin-based groups, right? Mediate with other societies. What do you mean by mediate? Like kind of, come to agreements, treaties, stuff like that in case there's conflict, right? And so the groups of chiefs, right, in a region, would kind of decide how to navigate problems, right? So in case there's a famine, right, or there's conflict with outside societies, right? These almost clan tribe areas would all come together, and the chiefs that led each tribe or clan would come together in a region and figure out what they wanted to do, right? That was kind of how they governed for the most part. And so this became really tough to govern as populations grow, right? So as population increases, it's very hard to have these almost informal systems, right, of governing. Right. And so what we are going to start to see as that population grows, especially after 1,000, is that these kin-based networks are just not going to cut it anymore. We're going to see the development of large kingdoms. And we're going to start with a new one. This is not in our textbook. This is new pretty much for this year. And that is the Hausa Kingdoms of modern-day Nigeria. Okay, so the Hausa Kingdoms of modern-day Nigeria are connected pretty loosely through kinship groups, right? Kinship ties kind of keeps them together. There is no central government of the kingdoms, right? Each kingdom is kind of in charge of itself. I believe there are 7. Is that what they said? Yeah, seven kingdoms. What this is a bunch of city-states, and each city-state kind of has its own specialization, right? Each city-state can focus on something and be really good at it, and then trade that with the other city-states, right? They talk about cotton being kind of major specialties here, right? They benefited from the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, right? And to kind of protect themselves from the Trans-Saharan possible attacks, right? They did have like a military state that was focused on being very, very good militarily. And of course, with the trans-Saharan trade, we will also eventually see the introduction of Islam in the 14th century. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the Hausa state. And now we're going to kind of talk about 4 major states that they want to talk about. We've already hinted at or looked at one of them, which is Ghana. Okay, but there's 4 major states to talk about here in Africa. I'm very surprised they didn't talk about another one, and so we're going to talk about that one a little bit. It's not a state per se; it's definitely a region, though, right? So Ghana is located in West Africa, not where the modern nation of Ghana is, but a little bit north, right? The key thing that they did here is that they controlled trans-Saharan trade to the north, and particularly in 3 goods. Let's say ivory, gold, and eventually slaves, or not eventually, but slaves in general, right? Their capital city is the city of Kumbi-Saleh. We have a centralized government here, a king of Ghana, who ruled from Kumbi-Saleh, with a military that used iron weapons, which they, of course, got from the Bantu tribes, right? However, basically, by the time we get to where we are, 1200, the Ghanaian kingdom, the kingdom of Ghana, is replaced by the kingdom of Mali, right? This is a very powerful trade state. It's founded by the man named Sundiata, who we'll talk a little bit more about in detail later. But one of the key things is that he is Muslim, and that because of this, he helped create trade relations with the North African merchants. He helped create a thriving gold trade out of the Mali Empire. And then, of course, his son, his nephew, who will rule Mansa Musa, makes the trek to Mecca, the Hajj, which we'll talk about again in a later section. Okay. Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe is in southern Central Africa. It is not on the coast, right? And let's talk about what Zimbabwe means at first. It is a dwelling, right? It's Bantu for dwellings. And specifically here, stone dwellings, right? Which displayed the wealth of the society, right? So how did they get so wealthy? Well, the major focus is trade to the Swahili coast. Trade to the Swahili coast, especially in gold and ivory and slaves, right? Kind of the 3 major goods that are being traded here. They talk about some other things, right? They were farmers, right? They were herders as well. And so they would tax that trade and make a lot of money off of it. And so they would go overland to the Swahili coast, but then they would use the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean. Right, they would use the Indian Ocean Trade Network to exchange those goods, right, which made them quite powerful. Again, the term Swahili is a blend of Arabic and Bantu, right? It's a syncretic language on the east coast of Africa, right? So we see kind of one of the key architectural traits of Zimbabwe is the Great Zimbabwe, which is kind of a fortress, huge, massive walls. What do they say, 30 feet tall, something like that. 30 feet tall, 15 feet thick, surrounding the capital city. This kind of displays their power, right, by the end of the 13th century. However, they run into a problem. They overgraze in the region, which leads to environmental. Let's go back. Which leads to environmental degradation. And that environmental degradation leads to people moving away from the Great Zimbabwe, which leads to the decline of the Great Zimbabwe. And by the end of the 1400s, they are kind of have moved away from there. Okay, our fourth main state, our final of the four big states that they want to talk about, is in Ethiopia. Now, it's not necessarily called Ethiopia at this point, but the key thing with Ethiopia is that it is a bastion of Christianity in Africa. It is the only Christian state at the time in Africa, right? And in particular, the kingdom of Aksum is a Christian nation, right? However, we do see the spread of Islam kind of come in and make the region much more diverse. And then, so the kingdom of Aksum is kind of connected to Christian. They bring that in. And they got it through Mediterranean trade networks and the Red Sea trade network and stuff like that. And then in the 12th century, we see a new Christian kingdom emerge in Ethiopia. And kind of the big thing that they have are the stone rock churches. The rock churches, which are literally churches carved into the side of mountains that are made entirely of rock, right? Which you can see on page 47, right? So those are super cool, and it's unique to Ethiopian culture. They've been doing this for hundreds, if not thousands, of years at this point because it's such a mountainous area. They don't have a whole lot of real estate to work with, so instead they work with the mountains and turn the mountains into buildings, right? So they develop. So not the problem, but a thing that comes up with Ethiopian Christianity is that they get isolated from the rest of the Christian world by Islam, right? They get kind of surrounded by Muslim states. And so because of that, they develop a unique style of Christianity, right? And in particular, two kind of key things. It's syncretic, right? They use African traditions, mostly ancestor veneration and belief in spirits, right? Which that belief in spirits then kind of manifests as wearing amulets to ward off the evil ones, right? So they create a unique form of faith there, right? But that's not the only thing that's unique about Africa. We've already talked about quite a lot of unique aspects of African politics, but let's talk about African social structures. Okay, so what is unique about African social structures? Well, the first one I want to point out is age grades. So age grades are a situation where you have work jobs are divided by age, right? So certain age groups do certain jobs, right? And so you kind of get promoted along with the rest of your age grade in your particular clan, right? So that's very, very unique. And then also the way gender works is different in this society more than most. So men are specialists for a large part of it, right? They focus on the specializations like they talk about blacksmithing, leather tanning, right, and stuff like that. Women are in charge of food, right? They're in charge of farming. They're in charge of food gathering if they are gathering food. And then they also are in charge of the homestead, right? Of making sure the home is taken care of, right? That includes the children as well. Okay. Slavery has had a very long history in Africa. And they don't necessarily talk about it here, but I do want to point out that slavery is one of the larger measures of wealth in African society. Because you guys recall, in Africa at this point, they had communal farms, right? The clan kind of held the farms together. And so because of that, right, you didn't necessarily measure wealth by how much farmland you had because everybody had the same, but rather by how many slaves you could have that could work that farmland and be more productive on that farmland, right? There are lots of different slave types in Africa at this point. You have prisoners of war. You have debtor slaves, right? Slaves who sold into debt, and then criminals, very similar to the Americas, right, or the Aztecs, right? Those are all kind of the same reasons. I guess they did kind of talk about this idea. They talked about the 3 forms of slavery. I'm not going to focus too much on that right now. Chattel slavery, though, is the major form of slavery we're probably acquainted with. Domestic slavery is almost the same thing. It's just that they're used in a different form or fashion, right? Now, slavery also kind of brings Africa into the larger hemispheric trade network, right? Because we also see the development of the Indian Ocean slave trade, because slaves are in high demand, and Africa, along with what is today Russia, were 2 of the bigger sources of slaves at the time, right? And so the enslaved Africans that go into the Indian Ocean slave trade are known as the Zanj, right? That is Arabic for slaves, right? Or at least specifically these East African slaves, right? And the Zanj, in fact, lead a rebellion in the city of Basra, right? And so they take over the city of Basra for over a decade, and hold it for quite a long time until they are finally defeated. Okay. So yeah. All right. Let's go to culture. Excuse me. Let's go to cultural life here. So one of the key things about African culture is the worship of ancestors, and also the practice of rituals, right? Especially weddings and funerals, right? So what we see here at these rituals, right? We got ritual worship of ancestors, right? Ancestor veneration is key. We also have weddings and funerals kind of being key rituals to celebrate ancestors, right? Especially funerals, because now, hey, you have a new ancestor. So at these rituals, though, what was celebrated and what was a way to communicate with the ancestors is song and dance. Right, song and dance and music help communicate with ancestors, and so they became a crucial part of African society and African culture, right? Especially when it comes to kind of rhythmic music to dance to, right? Became pretty crucial there, right? We also have a lot of visual arts, especially in the form of kind of these ceremonial masks, right? Ceremonial masks were part of the dance, but then on top of that, they talked about the kind of busts of past rulers, right? So those are like sculpted, sculpted heads of past rulers, especially in Benin, where they're well known for their iron and bronze sculptures, right? And then the last thing here, super important, the griots and the griotes, or griots, they might be pronounced the same way. Okay, so the griots are basically the holders of literature. Literature is orally passed down by the griots. And so because of that, they have a lot of power, right? The griots have quite a lot of power in this society. They had knowledge of your lineage. They had knowledge of your family, right? They were also good at singing and accompanying themselves with music to kind of talk about those stories, right? And so they were very powerful, right? They were very powerful people because they could basically talk your family down in history, right? They could kind of alter the history of a tribe, of a family, if they so wanted. So they became kind of political advisors as well, whether to kind of curry favor or actually because they were, good advisors, I don't know. And then you have the female version of the griots. They would sing on special occasions, and on top of that, they would help brides to be they would kind of counsel brides to be about what they need to do, such as apparently not talking back to your mother-in-law, and then if things got too bad, they could go home. Created a sense of empowerment within this mostly patriarchal society. And speaking of patriarchal society, we see this is probably not as patriarchal as most of the time. It's probably one of the more social gender equal societies. Not to say it is gender equal, it's just more so than others, right? And that'll about do it for developments in Africa. I will see you guys